Between light clouds as the sun was setting, I was watching the view and hadn't even realized. When the train had reached my destination, I got up in a hurry, grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and practically ran as I got off. The train, which had gradually begun to move off. Only a few people got off the train besides me. Stepping onto the railway station after 8 years, my mind became tangled in memories. Farrukhabad is a small town, and this was its run-down railway station. Every evening, when the train was due to arrive, I used to come and sit on some broken-down bench at the station, watching people come and go. Some looked content, others restless. As soon as the train left, the station would empty out. Every evening, as the sun set, the birds in the trees near the station would return, and I too would head home. The sun had already gone down, a light bitterly cold. Wind was blowing. Clouds were thickening, making the weather even colder. I glanced around, and then right in the middle of the station I spotted the only tea stall which hadn't been there before. Locals must have set it up recently. I ambled over in that direction. I ordered a cup of tea, held it in my hands, and began to take in the station. Taking small sips of tea, I watched a few empty wrappers that people had clearly thrown away, now drifting back and forth at the mercy of the wind. Apart from a handful of people, the station was deserted. After finishing my tea, I left the station. The cold was getting worse. Outside the station, horse-drawn carriages used to line up, but today there were none. Maybe they'd already taken passengers. And besides, I'd wasted time drinking my tea. Doing up all the buttons on my jacket, I set off on foot. From the station, the main road led straight towards the bazaar. This was the only market for people from 5 or 6 villages, where you could find the everyday necessities. Since this was a small town, by dusk the shopkeepers had already closed up and gone home, and after the shops shut, the bazaar was deserted. I began to think that stopping for tea had been a mistake. Walking on, the bazaar eventually came to an end at a road. There were usually some horse-drawn carriages here, waiting to go to the nearby town. But by the time I got there, I realized I was already too late. With a rumble of thunder, the rain started. Walking quickly, I stood under the tin awning of a closed shop in the bazaar, looking for any kind of vehicle. I must have stood there for over an hour. The rain stopped, but there wasn't a car in sight. In fact, apart from me, there wasn't another person to be seen. It had become completely dark. The cold was intense. I pulled my scarf out of my pocket, wrapped it around my neck, and set off on foot towards the village, which was 3 kilometers from the bazaar. When I was a child, during school holidays, I used to come to this same village to stay at my grandmother's place. Her house was at the far end of the village and had 2 doors. One door opened onto the village, and the other onto the road that led to the nearby towns and also to the very bazaar. I was now walking from My Name is Ali Muhammad. I used to work as a salesman for a private company in another country. My father had already moved there, and one by one he brought the whole family over. Our grandmother had passed away. Now only my grandfather, 3 uncles and their wives lived in the village. A fair used to be held in the village. I had come to see that fair. The plane arrived at Lahore airport 2 hours late. From there, I went straight to the railway station and caught the last train leaving Lahore, the same one I travelled on. My grandfather and uncles were the organisers of this village fair. The whole village used to take part. I had seen all this as a child. Colourful ice cream cones, wooden guns, clay laddus, paper boats. I wanted to see all of it just one more time. There was a longing to remember my village, my childhood. No matter where a person ends up in life, there are certain moments from their past that they never want to forget. When they grow tired of life's rush and bustle, they find themselves yearning for those times when they once lived carefree. That's why I too had made time in my busy life and set off for the village. But I was still on the way, and as I walked I kept thinking, if only there were another way to reach the village. Besides the train, just past the bazaar, at some distance there was a canal and a bridge to cross it. On one side of the bridge stood a small hut, where once upon a time an elderly man used to sell a few vegetables and fruits. Older folk coming and going from the village would often sit here with him and smoke from the hookah. Pause there for a moment. I kept looking at that broken-down hut, and from its dilapidated state it was clear that no one lived there anymore. With a cold sigh, shaking off the memories of the past, I walked on. The broken bridge over the canal looked even more frightening. Ignoring everything else, as I crossed it, straight for the sound of the flowing water. I took a deep look inside. Suddenly gave me the feeling that something had fallen in. Only lamps were burning. The noise was quite sharp. By their dim light, I stopped right there and looked towards where the sound had come from. And there was no one in that direction for a few moments. I dusted off my clothes, but now there was no movement to be felt. I shook my head and moved on. From the end of the bridge, this dirt road led towards the village. The road used to be somewhat wider, but now large bushes had grown up on both sides, so the path wasn't as open placed a hand on my shoulder. This dirt road passed right through the middle of the fields and also I lifted my head. Led to other towns. Before me stood an elderly man. The very first village along it was my destination. He asked, by now the road was barely 7 feet wide. I nodded, yes. I stopped for a moment and took a look at it. The muezzin and seemed quite frightening. Mosque. At that I clung to him with a rumble of thunder. Again. A light rain had started to fall. I had no place to stop now. Told him the whole I began walking quickly again, my name heading and my forward. Mother's name. The rain had turned the path to mud, making it difficult to walk on foot. Then he said, I had no choice. Son, there are many aspects to this matter. First of all, know that nothing happens without Allah's will. Thunder rolling through the sky. Those you met on the way were cold wind had set my teeth chattering. Then I kept walking, lost in my own thoughts. The first, when suddenly some sixth sense made me feel that someone was following me. That is a person's greatest enemy, and immediately spun around. The dim light of the lantern was my faith. Which had grown. I adjusted the bag hanging from my shoulder and set off again. By now I had been walking for over an hour. The rain had stopped. The clouds were slowly clearing, and the moon was beginning to find its place among them. In the moonlight the path was visible, but it looked far more terrifying than before. After walking a few more steps, I felt it again. Or you can strengthen your connection with Allah. Because of the mud, I could clearly hear the sound of footsteps, as if someone was following me. I kept moving forward, but all my attention was fixed on the sound behind me. I started to walk faster. At that very moment, I realized the footsteps behind me had also sped up. Now I was absolutely certain there was someone else back. A while later, a man entered the mosque leaning on my staff. I decided I would have to look behind me. He struck his staff on the ground and said, at exactly that moment, the footsteps behind me also stopped. I gathered my courage, in the deep silence of the night, the howls of jackals began to rise in the distance. The moon was shining brightly in all its glory, and moonlight spread everywhere. Fear had overwhelmed me. I didn't have the courage to turn around. Without looking back, I called out in a loud voice, one of them said, "Who's there?" In reply, I heard the very same question. I was about to say something, who's there? But he stopped me with a gesture gave me some comfort. Perhaps it was someone else coming along the same path. To the mosque, ignoring my fears, standing right there, I twisted my neck and looked behind me. But the moment I saw what was there, I felt the blood race through my veins. My hair stood on end. I was reciting surahs I didn't even remember. My eyes stayed wide open, frozen. He was standing there, just like me. Turning his neck, he was looking at me. I completed the prayer, that person was none other than myself. Yes, it was exactly me. The way I was standing, he was standing in exactly the same way. Suddenly, a scream escaped my mouth. I recited the holy verse in a loud voice. At that exact moment, he also screamed and recited the verse in the same manner. I saw the right after that, where I bolted to one side before. When I looked back while running, the scene had become even more terrifying. I understood. The way I was looking, he was looking back at me in the same way. Running in the opposite direction, I started running even faster. I saw a person in all that, walking in the my distance. Bag fell somewhere. I called out to him, but I didn't have the courage to pick it up. After running quite a distance, I walked quickly. When I looked back again, there was complete silence. When he I would stop every so often to catch my breath, even those who never start running again, because I was utterly exhausted. My mind was numb. I had never experienced anything like this before. The feeling that I was completely alone made me even more frightened. I just kept reciting the holy verse continuously. For the first time in my life, I was facing such circumstances. After a while, once my ragged breathing had steadied, I glanced all around me. There was a terrifying silence in every direction. In my frantic running, I had lost my way. Then, in the distance, I caught a glimpse of a light. I steadied my nerves and headed in that direction. hoping I might find someone there. After walking about half a kilometer, the light became clearer. In the moonlight, I could see that there was a hut. A ray of hope stirred in my heart. Farmers in the village often built such huts to protect their fields and would sleep there. As I walked, I reached the front of the hut and stopped. The door was made of wood and looked broken. Light was coming through a hole in the door, most likely from a lamp. A short distance from the door stood a large tree, and beneath it was a hand pump. I stepped forward, knocked on the door, and called out loudly, "Is anyone there? I need help. I've come from the city." I said all of this in a single breath. I waited for a while, but there was no answer from inside. Anxious, I pushed the door inward. It creaked open. Inside there was a clay water pot with a cup on top, and on a small clay platform a lamp was burning. Apart from these things, there was nothing else inside. Suddenly the lamp went out. As soon as the lamp went out, darkness swallowed everything. At that very moment, the howling of jackals started again. In the silence of the night, their cries sounded like a newborn baby wailing. Panicked, I turned back. Stepping out of the hut, I was startled by what I saw. A figure wrapped in white clothing was coming towards me. In their hand was a lantern, its flame burning very dimly. I hurried towards them with quick steps, wanting to reach them and ask for help. But as soon as I drew close enough to see their face, I screamed. That white garment was no ordinary clothing. It was a shroud, and the person wrapped in it was my exact double. Seeing him, my heart seemed to stop. My tongue would not obey. With great difficulty, I began to recite Ayatul Kursi in a loud voice, but I could only remember the first verse. The one standing before me began to recite the entire Ayatul Kursi in a voice far louder than mine. I could only repeat the first verse, while he kept reciting the whole thing. Despite the bitter cold, I was drenched in sweat. I began reciting the holy verse loudly and bolted to one side. My feet felt unbearably heavy with fear, but I kept on running. After running for a long time without looking back, I suddenly saw a high wall in front of me. It was about 4 feet tall and stretched far into the distance. I ran straight to the wall, placed my hands on it, jumped, and landed on the other side. I sat down right there on the ground. My breathing was completely ragged. My shins were bruised and scratched in several places from running. I was utterly exhausted. My mind had gone completely numb. I couldn't understand what was happening to me, or why. The wounds on my shins began to ache sharply in the cold wind. Meanwhile, the cold was at its peak. I sat there leaning against the wall for a long time, reciting the holy verses continuously, praying in my heart. "Oh Allah, what is this ordeal? Deliver me from it." Suddenly a thought struck me. Had I fallen into the clutches of jinn? But what puzzled me even more was that they were reciting the Quran better than me. Then I remembered I only prayed occasionally, and the last time I had opened the Quran was probably years ago. I had forgotten many surahs. I used to know Ayatul Kursi completely, but now only the first verse remained in my memory. In my heart I was begging Allah for forgiveness, pleading for another chance. Remembering the true Lord gave me some comfort. Somehow, I managed to stand up on my feet and looked around. This wall stretched far into the distance, disappearing into the darkness. I started walking in its shadow. The ground here was clean and bare, no bushes or anything. As I walked, I saw what looked like a mihrab ahead, but it was much larger than a mosque's mihrab. Seeing that mihrab gave me some relief. Perhaps it was an Eidgah. I went straight to the mihrab and sat down. I decided to stay there until morning. With that thought, I lay down. The weather had turned once again. The cold was growing more intense in the wind. Perhaps rain was coming. As soon as I closed my eyes, I sensed a presence nearby, as if someone was standing close to me. I opened my eyes with a start and saw a man standing. At a short distance from me and behind him, rows and rows of people stood with their hands folded. Everyone was completely silent. I lay there watching this scene. Suddenly, the man standing in front turned around and announced in a loud voice, "It is time to bury the deceased. The funeral prayer has been completed." Hearing this, I shot up in sheer terror and ran without any sense of direction. It was an open field, surrounded on all sides by a wall about 4 feet high. As I ran, the horrifying realization dawned on me. This wasn't an Eidgah, it was a funeral ground, and the place where I had been lying was where the body is placed. I ran straight to the wall, jumped over it once more, and landed on the other side, then got up and started running again. Thick clouds had covered the moonlight. The darkness had become very deep. I was running blindly. The ground was uneven. There were high earthen mounds that I kept leaping over. Suddenly a loud stinging slap hit my cheek. I stumbled 2 or 3 steps and fell into a deep trench. I tried to get up, but my body was bruised all over. My foot was badly injured from the fall. I groaned in pain. The trench was quite deep but narrow. Exhausted, I sat down and began to think of a way out. Suddenly something fell on me from above. I scrambled to look up. The moment I looked up, my breath stopped. Several people were standing around the trench. Each one of them was my exact double. Some had raised their hands in prayer, and others were throwing earth over me. I realized at once. What I had thought were earthen mounds were graves. This place was a graveyard, and I was inside a grave. I started screaming, but they all stopped praying and began throwing earth on me. I kept screaming. Then suddenly they stopped and walked away. As soon as they left, in the deep silence, the call to prayer echoed from somewhere in the distance. My breaths had felt stopped with fear, but hearing the adhan, I began to recover. I was so terrified that I began repeating the words of the adhan aloud from inside the grave. As the adhan ended, I gathered my courage and tried to climb out. And I succeeded. But outside it was still dark. It must have been the Tahajjud adhan, the silence of the graveyard and that scene. It was utterly terrifying. I determined the direction the adhan had come from and ran that way. After a long time I saw a small minaret ahead. I prayed from the bottom of my heart, "O God, let this be a mosque." By God's grace, when I reached near the minaret, I found I was right. It was indeed a small mosque, and a short distance away there were a few simple mud houses as well.